it's Jasper, and today I am answering a question I received via Instagram from my friend and fellow writer, Sophie Melissa. And the question is, how do you incorporate fairy tales and myth that you like into your story? Let's do this. So the first thing I want to say is thank you for this question. And also, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to answer it in the way that you're wanting. So if this video does nothing but to get more questions, DM me on Instagram or comment down below, which is what this was about. So the first way I incorporate myth and fairy tales that I love into my writing is by taking stories that I've read and gleaning from them the bare bones structure and laying it into my own story, or a part of my story, a story within my story, or taking that and incorporating it into a character. When we're talking about gleaning from myth or fairy tale and incorporating it into a character, often this will happen with a name. An example that I'm going to give that easily illustrates this and doesn't borrow from my own work, as I'm not wanting to reveal characters' names for my work just yet, is from Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. In Portrait, Stephen Dedalus, our main character, his name is taken from the Greco-Roman myth of Icarus and Daedalus. Icarus being the boy who flew too close to the sun, and Daedalus being the father who created the wax wings. Daedalus is an artist and a creator, and so the fact that Stephen Dedalus shares the name with this Greco-Roman figure applies to the character as we see him developed throughout it. Another way that I'll do this is I'll take common stories we've heard multiple versions of, and from that, make my own version. Another great example from our main man today, James Joyce, can you tell I like this guy? Is in his work Ulysses. Ulysses borrows the framework of the Odyssey and sets it in what was contemporary Dublin. And he accomplishes this grafting of the mythology into the everyday, not just by taking the framework of the Odyssey and utilizing it for his own story, but also by incorporating mythic figures like mermaids in everyday contemporary Ireland. Genius. The second way I incorporate myth and fairy tales I love into my own work is through my narration, which does a lot of name dropping, making reference at time to works by Yeats or dropping lines of Macbeth or Allingham's poetry. To me, the thing that I love about fairy tales and mythology is the vast tapestry of works which sort of weave into each other, that despite the place you're in or what story you're telling, there are commonalities throughout. And so in my own work, I wanted to reflect this idea that fairy tales and mythology are a tapestry and there are commonalities all over the place. And the third way I incorporate myth and fairy tales that I love into my own story, and this in truth is the most common way, is in imitating the voice or narrative techniques that I see employed in my favorite stories. A general example for a technique used through fairy tales is the rule of three. In fairy tales, you will have 3 sisters, 3 visitors, 3 little pigs. You'll have 3 main obstacles the protagonist has to go through. And very often these 3 things work to split the story into sections that are easily identified and track the progress of the story. And so, by using the rule of 3 in my own story, whether that is within a story within my story or the story itself, it gives it that fairy tale feel. An example of something common within mythology is that of giving titles. Within myth, myth has a strength, a power to it. It is epic and awesome and foundational and just everything. And so in mythology, it is very common that you don't just have the name of a character. It's not Finn, right? Who goes wandering and running about Ireland. It is Finn McCool and his fighting men, right? And very sometimes you get Finn McCool and his fighting men, you know, Finn who is son of so-and-so, 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 because genealogies are very important in mythology, because myth is about foundation, about where we come from, and it's not just knowing you know, the stories of these people, as in fairy tales, right? It's about the stories. In mythology, it's about who these people were, how are we connected to them, what have they done for us, how did they lay the foundations for what we have now. And so something that I love to do is borrow this from mythology. If I have a character who I want to be like just epic and everything and very important character, they're not just given a name, right? They're not just like, Shahrazad, which is an epic name, but a fairy tale one. You know, she's going to be Shahrazad, queen of the ever-living lands of the sun, moon, and stars. Who is this lady? I'd like to meet her / be her. As well, there are certain fairy tales and myths, certain collections which I will read over to get specific things from that work. For example, this collection is amazing for telling you a story in a hot second and just blowing your mind. Short and concise and powerful. This collection is creepy and humorous, sometimes long-winded, but man, if you're looking for the creepy and the humorous, this guy for fairy tales. Parallel has a beautiful way with description and dialogue that has an impact. Lady Gregory's Gods and Fighting Men is just straight up boss. She can tell stories very quickly, but also take her time. For description, for awesome titles, for power and creatures. Yes, this work. You read Beowulf, you know what I'm talking about. Just the idea of the epic of poetry to tell a story. Oh, this babe's so good. Hans Christian Andersen makes me cry. So if I want the feels, this is my guy. This isn't all my George MacDonald, but this is some of it. George MacDonald you can go to for anything, but specifically for symbolism in absolutely everything, George MacDonald, George MacDonald, George MacDonald. Oh, the Aeneid, baby! Also the Odyssey, the Iliad, trying to think. Oh, Livy's History of Rome, all very good options. For grandeur, for things about royals and destiny, check out them Greco-Romans. Early Irish myth and saga, awesome for fairly short and quick adventure narratives with some exceptions, but the way in which they move through the story, the pacing of these stories is very interesting. Creepy, blunt violence. Mwah! And there's like a million more books that I could go through. Not a million more, that would be great, wouldn't it? Imagine that library. There's lots of other books that I could go through, but the main thing is the fairy tales and mythology I love greatly impact my work and find their way in it in a variety of ways. The three main ways being gleaning from the overall story or particular characters, name dropping, and paying attention to voice and narrative techniques. There's a lot that can be learned from and gleaned from fairy tales and mythology. And I think the biggest thing that I would say is if you're going to borrow from myth and fairy tale, really read a lot around the subject. Understanding that it's not just the stories themselves you want to glean from, but also the way in which these stories are told. I hope this has been fun, interesting, and hopefully helpful. Again, if it's only created more questions, comment down below, DM me on Instagram, tweet, all that jazz. As always, guys, let's be a community of writers who help each other out. Cheers and cheers. And because I love fairy tales and mythology and folklore, I cannot help myself. What's happened to my voice? Oh dear. Ah. Familiarize yourself.
Okay, so this pile of books